Hey guys. All right. In this lecture here, bird is going to be the word. This is where we're going to identify different diagnostic characteristics of birds and help us reconstruct kind of their phylogeny of where do birds actually fit in. So first, let's define kind of what makes a bird. Like what makes a bird, right? There's lots of various different characteristics here that we can think of if we were to come up with a few features that we've learned so far up to this point, and perhaps that you might have known before. So things like pneumatic bones, toothlessness. So no bird today has teeth. Feathers, that retroverted pubis into kind of more of that ornithischian condition that we've seen. So that bird-hipped condition. A shortened tail with that pygostyle. So a lot of these other things, furcula's, some of these you might not be familiar with in terms of more specifics, but just to give you an idea, I'm highlighting the ones that are plesiomorphic and then the ones that are actually convergent. So the plesiomorphic characteristics are the ones that all birds have evolved and retained from an ancestral state. So somewhere before where we were kind of landing here, either at Maniraptora, Maniraptoriformes, maybe even before then, maybe even all the way down to Dinosauria, depending on kind of where that evolutionary novelty started taking place. That's what we have as a plesiomorphy, right? So those all are ancestral characteristics that birds continue. But those in the orange, so toothlessness, the pygostyle, and the enlarged sternum are actually convergent. So these are going to evolve independently and multiple times within this kind of grouping of birds. And so that's what we're going to kind of see that those are some of those characteristics we can't always use consistently. So the first major group is going to be the Aviale. That's what's going to synonymize effectively all of our birds. And we're going to look at more extinct birds and then make our way into modern birds today. So the first bird is what we call Archaeopteryx. It occurred around late Jurassic, is when its kind of first presence was around. And that we talked about this bird here before. This is the one that's in the Berlin Museum of Natural History in Germany. And it's got these beautiful splays of feathers, not only by its wings, but also along its body and its tail as well, too. It's going to have the typical characteristics that a bird's going to have that we're going to look at over the next few slides as well, too. Now, one of the things is that it also does have some non-bird features as well. So then why would we call it a bird? Well, in this case here, it has more bird-like features than it does bird non-like features, right? And so at some point there's a transition between these. These are what we call transitional species that help us identify the connection between something that isn't, in this case, a bird to something that is. What you can see is that these animals started evolving really early. I mean, late Jurassic, even before some of the major dinosaurs started to evolve. So then what specifically makes a bird, right? So the first characteristic I've got listed here is their arm length is equal to or longer than their leg length. And so in this case here, we're starting to equalize the appendicular skeleton to become similar. One half is going to become flight. The other half is going to become landing and grasping. And in terms of that grasping, they also form what's called a nesodactyl foot. So this means of four toes. There is one that has kind of a different direction. So it's not, so that's where you're seeing here on the bottom right, and as well as the top left or top right. This isn't necessarily having like a thumb, but it's having that aspect where it can imagine my arm is like a branch, and you come around and you're going to perch onto it. So having that capability to grasp onto things, perch stuff, is also going to require you to reduce the capability of your forelimbs into more wings and losing the digits there as well too, because now your hind limbs are taking care of that grasping component rather than your arms, right? So the next group here are ornithothoraces. So these will start to develop that very characteristic large keel on that sternum. So whenever you've had a turkey for Thanksgiving or a chicken breast or something, that big keel on that sternum, that's kind of like part that comes out, that's what we're talking about, okay? And so this is where that modification starts to occur, that evolutionary novelty. The other things that they do is that they do modify their shoulder girdle. and how the forelimb begins to attach to it, because we're starting to get to the point of a pre-adaptation of experimenting with some aspects of flight here. Not necessarily powered flight just yet, but we're getting to that. So we split these into two groups. Enantiornis, these are what we refer to as opposite birds, other than the true birds, which are euornithes. But these ones, so Enantiornis are still going to have teeth. They're going to still have clawed fingers on their forelimbs, whereas modern birds don't. And their histology indicates that they actually grew pretty slowly, which is very different relative to what modern birds do. Modern birds have an incredibly fast growth rate, to the point where, for instance, an ostrich, which grows from about a softball size egg to something that's about 7.5 to 8 feet tall in less than 1.5 years, which is unbelievable. So next one up then in terms of groupings are the Ornithuri. These are going to be characterized again by a shortened tail, even more so, and is going to be less than the length of their femur. So not only is the pygostyle there at the very end, those last few kind of vertebrae fusing, now we're even further shortening these tails. One of the neat features about this group, though, is that we start seeing an offshoot of diving birds. So these are going to be almost completely aquatic animals. They can still go on land as well, too, but they're going to dive in and almost act sort of like penguins do these days, but have more of a capability of doing this and being on land than a penguin does. So you can see some pictures here of Hesperornis and Ichthyornis here at the very bottom. And then we finally get into aves, all modern birds. So that's the characteristic group of birds. So these are going to be split into two groups based on the capability of or the anatomy of their secondary palate, kind of the roof of their mouth. And this is going to be called Palagnathae. All of these end up becoming secondarily flightless. So they've evolved into these flightless animals, usually of a larger size, so something like an ostrich or emu. But we also do have these little cute guys called kiwis that are present in kind of the Oceania region of New Zealand. And so they're these little tiny cute guys. But the neognaths are going to be the majority of almost all other birds. So they are split into two groups themselves. Gallorancerae and Neoaves. Gallorancerae are a lot of your fowls, so your ducks, your chickens, things like that. Whereas your Neoaves, about 95% of the type of diversity of birds that are out there today. Parrots, hawks, penguins, flamingos, owls, sparrows, whatever you name it, it probably is in part of the group of the Neoaves. All right, so that ends this lecture here. We're going to move on for the next one for adaptations for flight. Take note that I'm just kind of going through some of the general groupings of the birds. If we wanted to go into a lot more of these different specific groupings, that would be a completely other course that I teach called ornithology. All right, so that ends this lecture here.